This is Peter Schiff. You know, another great Christmas present are my books. And you can get one for free if you take the audiobook. Go to audiblepodcast.com/Schiff and choose any one of my 5 books. Get an audio version of the book for nothing, free, right? And make it a gift. Give it to somebody that you think could benefit from the rational perspective expressed in those books. So again, it's audiblepodcast.com/Schiff. And make sure and put the /Schiff so they know that you heard about it from this show, and you get your audiobook for free. And hey, if you like the idea, maybe buy one too. Joining the program now is Jonathan Bydlak. Jonathan is president of a coalition to reduce spending. He actually worked for Ron Paul as the director of fundraising for his 2008 presidential campaign. After that, he founded the independent consulting firm Bydlak and Associates. And he was a analyst for a hedge fund when he began his career, and he graduated with a degree in economics from Princeton University. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Peter. Good morning.
Sure. So you think that Grover Norquist, who of course is in the news all the time now, and he's getting probably more publicity than I've ever seen Grover Norquist get in his life. You know, by the way, he did a blurb on my most recent book. Maybe if he was this popular, I couldn't have got him. I don't know. But everybody talks about Grover Norquist. You want to be the new Grover Norquist, but tell me why your pledge is better than his, and why we really need people to be thinking about the Bydlak pledge rather than the Norquist pledge.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I want to become the next Grover. What I do want to do is make people realize that spending is the issue of our day, and that spending is the problem that we have right now. And so, the pledge that we're putting out, which, by the way, I should say that I think that Grover's model has been very effective. The reality is that Grover wouldn't be in the news right now if people didn't find his pledge so convincing. And when I think
it was effective. You're right. It was effective in preventing current tax increases. But since, as we both know, the real cost of government is not measured by taxation, but by spending, the burden on taxpayers has grown enormously despite the Norquist pledge, because politicians have honored their pledge, but they've kept voting to spend money anyway, which means that eventually the bill has to be paid, and it's even bigger because we've got all the interest on the money we borrowed because we didn't raise taxes.
That's exactly right. For a long time, fear of taxes going up was essentially a check on increased spending. And what's happened, mainly in the Bush and Obama administrations, is that both parties have now realized, well, it's easy to say we're not going to raise taxes because we can just end up going and borrowing to finance all these programs and wars overseas and what have you anyway. And so, now instead of raising taxes to pay for everything that government politicians want to pay for, we now have just run big budget deficits, and that's why we've seen the ballooning of our national debt. And so my claim is,
and especially when you have the Federal Reserve willing to monetize all that debt to keep interest rates artificially low, because normally the consequence of big deficits would be higher interest rates, which would mean higher mortgage rates and things like that. But we're not even getting the consequence of the big deficits because the Fed is temporarily sparing us from those consequences by buying up all the bonds.
Right, exactly. I was asked in an interview the other day what I think about, starve the beast, the notion that, by taking away tax dollars, you're able to shrink the size of government. And my comment was, perhaps a little flippant, but I said that, ultimately you can take the food away from the beast, but if you've still got a feeding tube shoved down his throat, in the form of borrowing and the issuing of new treasury bonds, are you really starving him? And to me, that's exactly what's going on.
No, he's not. He just found another banquet to gorge himself at. And in fact, the politicians would rather feast on debt and inflation than taxation, because the voters don't realize that they're paying those costs, because the politicians want to promise all sorts of freebies to the middle class, but they still want their votes. They can't win the election just by getting the votes of the poor. They have to get the votes of the middle class too, and therefore they have to pretend that all this government can come at no cost to the middle class.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the distortions that are caused by money creation and borrowing are arguably more pernicious than by taxation, because, taxation is obviously distortionary in the here and now. But, one of the problems when you start messing with the interest rate market is that, you end up distorting, incentives to invest and consume, not just today, but tomorrow as well. And so, I think that ultimately we've created a situation where, we're not just harming our current economic prosperity, but we're jeopardizing our future prosperity as a result.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that anybody who has signed the Norquist Pledge, but simultaneously has voted for more spending and higher debt ceilings, has violated the very spirit of that pledge, because by voting for more government, you're voting to make government more expensive, and you're ultimately increasing the burden. Because remember, all that debt that the government has accumulated has to be repaid by the very taxpayers whose taxes aren't being raised. So maybe my taxes aren't going up, but my share of the national debt is going up. That's like a real liability. It's like my mortgage getting bigger and bigger. Eventually, I have to pay it back. So if you're signing that pledge and voting for tax increases, then as far as I'm concerned, you violated that pledge.
That's exactly
and you're voting
right.
for spending increases.
Paul Molshine, a columnist for the New Jersey Star-Ledger a few months ago, wrote an article and made a comment that anyone who signs the taxpayer protection pledge but also doesn't sign our anti-debt pledge is a hypocrite. And his reasoning was exactly what you presented, which is that you're essentially voting to increase future tax burdens if you're not, if you're voting for more spending.
Right. So if you want to be honest, which of course most people who want to be honest don't go into politics, which I guess is problematic. But if you want to be honest with voters and you want to tell the voters that you don't want to raise their taxes, then you also have to be honest in saying we can't give you more benefits. We can't give you more government provided health care, more government provided education, more government provided anything, because we can't raise your taxes. So you're going to have to earn those things on your own. In fact, if we're not going to raise your taxes, we already have too much government. We have to cut government right now. See, the truth is, politicians have to say, look, if you want a bunch of taxes, it's going to cost. You're going to have to pay through the nose. If America wants to live in a cradle-to-grave, socialist, utopian economy, if this is how we want to live, if we want European-style socialism, then we're going to have to pay for it. And it means that everybody is going to have a lower standard of living. The middle class are going to have to give up a lot to get all this government.
Right. I think a lot of people get this, Phil, on a very fundamental level. If you ask the average person, you're spending $5,000 a month, you're spending $10,000 a month, but you're only making $5,000. What do you need to do? The average person is going to say, well, I need to cut back fundamentally on my spending, not I need to go to my boss and ask for a $5,000 a month raise. So, people have to balance budgets in their own lives. They understand how this works. The problem is they don't always make the connection between what they would do in their personal life to what it needs to happen in the public sphere. And part of my argument is because the reason that happens is because they don't actually have a means to do anything about it. And so as a result...
And they also, though, Jonathan, don't understand, and that's maybe what your organization can help do, is they don't understand what the national debt means to them in respect to future tax increases. We see this right now on a state level. I'm living in Connecticut, and we just had across-the-board tax increases that hit everybody, not just the rich. But the reason we had to raise taxes was because the government had a big deficit, and it had to raise taxes to finance it. And so when you have these big deficits, it means that tax rates are coming in the future because the taxpayer is on the hook. So the public has to know that just because their taxes aren't raised today, the very fact that we ran $1 trillion deficit means their taxes have to go up eventually, because it's like they just took out a second mortgage on their house, except they spent the money on somebody else instead of themselves, but they're still responsible for making the payments.
Right. And I think the tricky thing right now is that politicians don't really have much of an incentive to cut spending. I mean, if you think about, what is the goal of the average politician? Well, it's obviously to get reelected. And historically, the easiest way to do that is to go back to your district and say that you're bringing home the pork. And when you combine that with, various lobbying groups that are sort of pushing for their own piece of the pie, if you will, there really isn't a counterweight on the other side that is advocating for reducing expenditures. Milton Friedman had a great quote where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect that the challenge of politics is to create good incentives so that bad people do good things. And to me, that really sums up what we're dealing with. That it's a little bit naive to think that we're ever going to get 218 members of the House and 60 members in the Senate to be able to be ideologically committed to reducing expenditure. And so the question is really, are there ways in which we can start to incentivize people who otherwise might not be inclined to our understanding of economics to
especially Jonathan, we've got, I mentioned today now, a new record. Almost 48 million Americans on food stamps. We'll probably be at 50 million Americans early in 2013. That's a lot of Americans whose votes have been purchased by the politicians, and we really have to rile up what is a real minority in America, and that's the people who actually work for a living and pay the taxes. They need to start to understand the score and what the battle is here. The battle for real freedom in America, we've got to bring this issue to the table and unite the workers of both parties, right? The Democrats and the Republicans, the people who are paying for all this government and who are going to be made to pay for it because they're the only ones that can pay the higher taxes. Look, when the government raises taxes to pay off the debt, the people on welfare and Social Security and food stamps, they're not going to be there. They're not going to pay anything. There are 47% of the Americans that aren't paying any income taxes at all. They don't care how high the income tax goes because they're not paying it.
Right. Well, I mean, the beneficiaries of the current system tend to be the very poor and the very rich, right? Because the flip side to what you've just said is that you've got banks that are getting bailouts and whatnot, and corporate welfare, and they're obviously benefiting from the current system too, right? But the burden.
Well, it's not all the very rich. It's just certain wealthy people that are connected politically that are able to make their money through a certain method. But there are plenty of very wealthy people who are paying a ton of taxes who can't get some of these special breaks that are reserved to maybe some of the bankers out there. But that's not the only way to make money is by being a banker. But you're right. There are some wealthy people who are politically connected and are working with the Fed, and they're getting rich, and they're helping to bleed everybody else dry.
That's right, and that's why I think our organization is well poised to sort of try to make an impact on this. I think that there are a lot of organizations that talk about the need to cut spending, but they get involved in 20 other issues, and we're trying to say the issue of our day is the need to cut spending and the need to balance the budget. And
all right, so we got a quick break. When we come back, though, I want to talk about that specifically, about your organization, your pledge, who signed it, who's thinking about signing it, what kind of impact you're making, and what, if anything, my audience can do to help you. So we'll be right back. Don't go away. We're talking with Jonathan Bydlak, who's got a pledge of his own that he's asking our current office holders and prospective office holders to sign. But unlike the Grover Norquist pledge, this one is more honest and actually probably more difficult. And that is a pledge where the individual signers promise not to increase spending, not to vote for any increases in government spending. And Jonathan, that would include Social Security, Medicare, and the defense, would it not?
Yeah, so we're basically asking three things. The first is that candidates will only vote for balanced budgets. The second is that they won't vote for new spending programs that aren't offset elsewhere in the budget. And the third is that they won't vote to increase borrowing or raise the debt ceiling.
Right. Well, that would pretty much put us in the same predicament. You have people now criticizing Grover Norquist because people don't want to raise taxes to enable us to get past this economic crisis, fiscal cliff, but if they sign your pledge, it's the same position because they can't vote to increase the debt ceiling.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, right, we need to start providing reasons and methods for candidates and elected officials to hold spending down. And the easiest way to do that is to start to take away the funds that they have access to.
When they try to say that it's a disaster if we don't raise the debt ceiling, what they're admitting that government is too big because they're saying if we actually have to pay for our government that it will be a disaster. See, it's not. The thing is, by raising the debt ceiling, we just delay the bills. That just means we pay the bills later. But if the bills are too big to pay now, how can we afford them later when they'll be even bigger by definition?
Well, that's exactly right. And, and our big frustration has always been that, you have so many people who run for office and they say, they're serious about tackling the national debt, or they call themselves a fiscal conservative, but then they get into office and they start voting for, all the spending bills that come across their desk. And so,
Okay, so is there anybody in Congress right now that signed your pledge?
Yes, so Ted Cruz, for example, who's the new senator from Texas, signed, which a very interesting story there was that he was actually one of our first signers, and as a result of him, putting his name down on paper, we ended up getting his opponent in the runoff, Dave Dewhurst, doing the same. So a good example of how you can start to use political pressure to get people on the record who otherwise might not be interested in signing. A similar thing happened in Georgia. We had Doug Collins, who's now the representative-elect from Georgia's 9th District, signed the pledge, and all indications seem to be that he's saying the right things about being serious about cutting spending. And most importantly, I think the thing that is the most fundamental thing at the core of our pledge is this notion that all spending needs to be on the table. Because a big part of the problem is that, of course, you've had Republicans who haven't wanted to put military spending on the table, and Democrats who don't want to address entitlements. And so one of the big messages that we're pushing as an organization, and one of the things that both Cruz and Collins have signed on to, is this idea that we have to consider everything open to reduction. And I think that's the way that you're...
Yeah, well, I would think that your pledge should be a real litmus test in Republican primaries. If you can't get incumbents to sign that pledge, you got to make sure that all their opponents do and hold it over them as an issue in the election. Why won't you commit not to growing government? If you're going to run as a Republican and in a primary and you're going to tell the constituents that you believe in small government, then why not sign a pledge that commits you to small government? Because if you're going to increase government spending, then you don't believe in small government. You want to take an enormous government and make it even bigger.
That's right. And, but I will say that, I don't see this as necessarily a Republican or a conservative issue. I mean, we had an independent running in Colorado who signed the pledge. We had a Democrat running in New York. We've had a number of libertarians.
You had a Democrat? You had a Democrat sign the pledge?
We did, yes.
So, a Democrat to agree not to spend more money?
Again, Justin Amash, Congressman Amash from Michigan, had a balanced budget amendment in 2010, and he had, I think it was 12 or 13 co-signers onto that bill. Now, of course... Yeah,
it's possible, I guess, that there are fiscally responsible Democrats. I mean, there could be Democrats that want big government, but they're at least honest enough to think that we have to pay for it. So at least you can respect that, right?
There was a poll done a year ago that basically asked people, do you think that should we balance the budget and should we cut spending as a means of doing so? And what it found was that support among independents was just as high as support among conservatives, and that even a majority of Democrats are in favor of balancing the budget and cutting spending. And so, I think there's sort of this caricature out there that, everyone on the left thinks that everyone on the right are just these crazy kooky Tea Partiers, and everyone on the right thinks that everyone on the left is Paul Krugman. And the reality is that that's not true at all. And I've found that there are plenty of people on the left who they may think that there are many things that the government does that are worthwhile, but at the end of the day, they agree that we should be paying for them, and we shouldn't be running up massive budget deficits.
Well, I think the one problem, I do believe that when you ask people the question in general, do you support a balanced budget, or do you support, even if it means lower spending, they'll say yes, because they're assuming that the spending doesn't affect them. But I think when you ask the question of Social Security recipients, are you willing to have lower Social Security benefits right now to balance the budget, right? That they're not going to answer that way. Or are you willing to accept higher taxes on yourself? I think a lot of the Democrats are willing to balance the budget because they think it can be done by taxing the rich, that the rich are getting away with murder, they're not paying their fair share, and that's why the budget isn't balanced, because the rich aren't paying their fair share. So I think, a lot of it depends on how you ask the question. I mean, how many people are going to answer the question, yes, I'm willing to pay more taxes myself, or I'm willing to accept a reduction in my current government benefits in order to balance the budget?
Sure. But you know what? I mean, Scott Rasmussen did a poll last Monday where he found that 48% of Americans believe that, as we said earlier, all spending should be on the table, that they thought that entitlement spending and military spending specifically should be reduced as a means of balancing the budget. So you may be right that people don't ultimately understand how all the intricacies of various policies work. But I think there's a massive constituency for this idea that, you put your sacred cow on the chopping block, and I'll put my sacred cow on the chopping block. And instead of compromising to, increase expenditures, let's come together and agree to actually cut.
Well, Jonathan, look, I hope you're right, and I wish you the best of luck. How can my audience get a hold of you? What's your website, or what can people do to help you?
Sure, yeah. So our website is reducespending.org. We're actually running a contest right now where we're giving away iPads for the first people who are able to get their representatives or senators to sign our pledge. So there's a great incentive for everyone to try to go and get their congressman on the
Is that
on the
a
record.
full iPad or the mini?
Well, it actually depends on whether you win the first place prize or the second place prize. So we got the first place prize is an iPad. Second place is an iPod, actually. So get out there quickly and get your representative. And
I probably don't have much chance of winning because all the representatives in Connecticut are Democrats. So I don't know that I could get anybody to sign it here, but maybe somebody can win that iPad. Anyway, Jonathan, thanks a lot. Appreciate the good work that you're doing. Everybody else, hour 2 of the Peter Schiff Show is coming up next. Stick around. We'll be right back.